The Viking world was harsh, unforgiving, and beautiful. Without stores, electricity, or modern tools, survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations. Every forest, river, and coastline was a pantry, a workshop, and a classroom. In this video, we'll explore 7 genius Viking survival techniques that modern preppers have completely overlooked. Skills that kept families fed, warm, and alive in some of the most extreme conditions imaginable. Bark bread. In the Viking Age, hunger was as real as the icy winds from the North Sea. When crops failed or voyages returned empty, survival meant turning to the forest. Birch and pine, sacred trees of the north, became more than timber. They became bread. Vikings stripped away the dark outer bark to reach the pale cambium beneath, a thin layer rich in desperate calories. This wasn't food of choice, but food of necessity. Elders taught which trees gave life and which hid poison. A wrong cut could doom not just the tree, but the family relying on it. Harvesting bark was grueling. Families worked in spring when sap ran strong and bark loosened. Long strips were peeled, dried near hearth fires, then ground into coarse flour. Mixed with what little grain remained, it became a harsh bread with the taste of resin and earth. Chroniclers spoke of its bitterness, but also its power to keep warriors strong enough to see another season. For Vikings, bark bread was never forgotten. It symbolized resilience, the will to endure long winters, famine, and voyages where supplies dwindled. It was not a feast for gods, but it was fuel for survival, keeping clans alive until the fjords blossomed again. The Viking art of rope and cordage. For the Vikings, a rope was as vital as a sword. Without it, sails would not rise, ships could not dock, and shelters would collapse under the northern storms. Yet in their age, there were no markets filled with ready-made cordage. Instead, the Vikings learned to weave strength directly from nature. Summer nettles, spring willow bark, and even strands of human hair cut during rituals. Each could be transformed into a lifeline. Nettle stalks were soaked in water for days until the outer husk softened and peeled away, revealing fine, silky fibers. Willow bark was stripped fresh, twisted while damp, and hardened as it dried, becoming even stronger. Some sagas even tell of women's braided hair being used as rope, lowering warriors from fortress walls in desperate escapes. The technique was precise. Fibers twisted one way, then strands counter-twisted into bundles. This opposite tension created cords that tightened under strain, becoming nearly unbreakable. What seemed like a simple rope was in truth the hidden muscle of Viking life, hoisting sails, binding shelters, and securing survival itself. In the Viking world, rope was not just a tool, but the very thread of fate woven by human hands. Viking wilderness, food procurement. For the Vikings, survival wasn't about stocking shelves or waiting for aid. It was about knowing the land like it was their own pantry. Forests, rivers, and coastal waters were not just scenery. They were life-sustaining ecosystems. A skilled Viking could feed a family entirely from what nature provided, even when crops failed or winter approached early. Fishing required ingenuity. Hooks were carved from bone or thorn, bent with heat to the perfect curve. Traps and weirs, constructed from woven branches, guided fish into holding areas overnight. These weren't random setups. They were carefully engineered based on generations of observation, understanding which currents fish followed and where they nested. Foraging went far beyond picking berries. Vikings knew hundreds of edible plants, the right season to harvest them, and the proper preparation to remove toxins. Acorns were leached to remove bitter tannins, roots were boiled or roasted to become digestible, and certain herbs were dried and stored to prevent scurvy. Even insects and larvae provided protein in desperate times. Preservation was equally advanced. Meat was dried in the wind or smoked over low fires, taking care to protect it from insects while retaining nutrients. Grains were stored in elevated containers to avoid moisture and rodents. Every meal was a product of careful observation, experimentation, and a deep connection to the land. For a Viking, wilderness food procurement wasn't just skill, it was a daily practice of reading the environment, predicting patterns, and turning raw survival into a precise, almost scientific art. Viking tool, making and craftsmanship. Vikings were not just warriors, they were master craftsmen. Every forest, riverbank, and rocky outcrop was a workshop, waiting to be shaped into tools, weapons, and everyday items. There were no stores, no factories, only materials and knowledge passed down through generations. Knife and blade making began with selecting the perfect stone or salvaging metal. Flint, obsidian, and iron were carefully examined for fracture patterns and hardness. The knapping process, striking stone at precise angles to create razor-sharp edges, was a skill that could take years to master. Metal blades required forging and tempering, combining heat and water to achieve both flexibility and strength. Handles were crafted from wood, bone, or antler. They were split, shaped, and then bound with sinew or hide in ways that allowed the tool to withstand intense pressure. Rope, fiber, and leather were used to secure joints, creating implements that would last for decades. Even bones of animals were repurposed into needles, awls, and fishing hooks, each carefully selected for their unique properties. Containers were no less sophisticated. Birch bark sheets were folded into waterproof vessels, clay was shaped, and fired into pots capable of cooking and storing food. Every tool and implement reflected a deep understanding of materials, physics, and design. For Vikings, crafting was survival. It wasn't artistry for show, it was life itself. A well-made tool could mean the difference between a successful raid, a bountiful harvest, or a harsh, unforgiving winter. Viking shelter and fire mastery. In the harsh northern climates, exposure meant death. Vikings didn't have insulated homes, central heating, or weather alerts. They had knowledge, observation, and ingenuity. Shelter was built not for comfort alone but for survival, often from whatever the land provided. Earth and sod were key materials. Vikings dug partially underground homes, using the Earth's natural insulation to maintain warmth during freezing winters. Wooden frames were layered with turf, moss, and branches, creating thick walls that kept heat in and wind out. Ventilation shafts allowed smoke to escape while retaining warmth, demonstrating an advanced understanding of airflow centuries ahead of its time. Fire was equally essential. Vikings mastered ignition even in pouring rain. Fatwood from resin-rich pine, birch bark, and prepared tinder allowed flames to catch quickly. Fires were maintained systematically. Small embers saved for overnight warmth, larger hearths for cooking and drying clothes. Fire wasn't just heat. It was a lifeline, a signal, and a tool. Clothing worked in tandem with shelter. Animal furs, properly treated, created breathable, waterproof garments. Layers were strategically combined, with wool and linen against the skin and heavier furs on top, allowing Vikings to endure blizzards while performing daily tasks. Even simple shelters and clothes were crafted with scientific precision, orientation for sunlight, insulation against prevailing winds, and fire placement for optimal warmth. For a Viking, surviving the elements wasn't luck. It was preparation, understanding, and respect for nature's patterns. Every shelter, every fire, and every garment reflected lessons learned over generations, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. Viking resource mastery and multi-use knowledge. Vikings lived in a world where every resource mattered. Nothing was wasted, and everything served multiple purposes. Ashes, bones, hides, and plants were all transformed into tools, medicines, or sustenance. Knowledge of these resources was passed down orally and practically, ensuring survival across generations. Ash, for example, wasn't discarded. It became soap, cleaning agents, and even used in metalworking. Different woods produced different chemical properties, and knowing which ash to use for soap versus food preservation was critical. Bones were not just for food, they became needles, awls, hooks, and structural supports. Hides were tanned for clothing, rope, or even water containers, and every part of a hunted animal found a purpose. Plants were similarly versatile. Some herbs preserved food, others healed wounds or prevented scurvy. Even bark could become emergency flour when famine struck. Vikings understood seasonal cycles, growth patterns, and chemical properties in ways modern survivalists rarely study. They created a living system where skills, knowledge, and resources intertwined, forming a network of resilience. Perhaps the most remarkable Viking skill was redundancy. Critical knowledge wasn't stored in one person or one tool. It was spread across families and communities. Children were taught survival through games, songs, and stories, ensuring that no disaster could erase vital techniques. Every home, every farm, every ship became a node in a vast human knowledge network. In the end, Viking resource mastery wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving under extreme conditions. Every skill, every tool, and every piece of knowledge worked together to create an ecosystem of resilience. Their genius wasn't in technology, but in understanding nature, maximizing every resource, and teaching communities to do the same. These 7 Viking survival techniques weren't just clever tricks. They were a way of life, from crafting tools and shelters to mastering fire, foraging, and resource use. Vikings thrived where most would have perished. Modern convenience may have dulled our skills, but their ingenuity reminds us what's possible when humans truly understand and work with nature. Which of these Viking methods would you try first? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the past teaches the most valuable lessons for survival today.